Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Mike Briggs looks at high prices in the cattle markets. Ron Brodersen discusses the continuing impact of the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. Tapan Padak explains why early planted soybeans may hold a climatological advantage. And Bob Wright talks about rootworm resistance in Nebraska corn. Before we begin, we'd like to welcome our new audience in Canada. Market Journal can now be seen across the country in Canada on the Rural Channel. You can check your local listings for additional days and times to see this show. Mike Briggs is our cattle market analyst this week. We talked with Mike on a windy and rainy Wednesday morning about U.S. beef demand, his outlook on corn prices, the effects of ongoing drought, and how the month of April has treated the feedlot industry.
Pretty darn good so far. You know, weather's held in there, the market's held in there, margins are excellent. You know, people are always asking me what this market's been like, and I said, you know, the past 2 years were the worst I've ever seen, and probably the worst some guys that have been in there for 40 years ever seen, and now it's the best I've ever seen. It's incredible.
What would get the ball rolling in either direction, either moving it higher or moving it lower?
I think a lot of it's going to be cattle supplies. The economy is always a factor. I think it's going to be interesting to see as we go forward here. We took a little dip in the beef market. We took a little dip in the cattle market compared to the high. Typically, you have a seasonal that goes down now, but you've already seen the beef market start to catch, and we're going to be staring Memorial Day right in front of us here pretty quick, and that's your biggest beef holiday of the year. So it's going to be really interesting if we can turn this thing back around and get back to old highs or maybe make new highs. If you have some pent-up demand in the East, and I know that retailers haven't been buying out very far, which why would you with these prices, but they get caught short bought, and this thing could get real interesting maybe for a short period of time.
Packers still need to fill, you think, going forward?
I'm afraid so. I don't think they're sold out in front very long. I just can't see very many retailers wanting to take that step with this price.
With the margins where they are right now, has time in the feedlot changed in terms of how much weight you're putting on these animals?
Great question. I read a lot of these letters from all the big shots that ride them, and oh, the people can't be current because the weights are so big. What they've totally missed is we've had an excellent winter. Every year your genetics get better. These cattle have a better ability to gain faster and get bigger, and that's what they're doing. We had perfect weather. It was dry. I know it was cold, but it was dry. The cattle performance is tremendous. So these cattle are at market-ready weights. They don't have a lot of finish on them, but everybody's selling them as fast as they can because, one, we know what the seasonal is. The seasonal is typically to go down. The cattle are making a lot of money. You're just being greedy if you're holding them.
Last month when we talked, you had started to price some cattle. What's the difference now between the cash and the board?
You still have the cash at a premium to the board, which is great for the market because that's going to keep cattle moving. It'll keep people from holding cattle, and that's always a sign of a really bullish market. I know we're going to lose some of that basis. We already have lost some of it, but I wouldn't be surprised if we sell cattle at overs indefinitely. I just wouldn't, because I think the supply is going to be tight enough, and unless you see something change where you start to see funds just come rushing into the long side of this thing and try to drive it up equal to cash, it's not going to happen.
Futures market corn is around $5, obviously less than that if you're buying locally. What are your expectations going through May?
I still think we're going to get the crop planted, and once everybody's decided that the crop either is going to get planted or has gotten planted, I don't think there's any way for this thing but down unless you run into a dryness situation, which we're not very far off from that in the western corn belt here. They talk about El Nino, and if El Nino does occur, that's going to take care of the drought in the area, so that'll be nice.
You look at the talk of herd expansion, and now it's starting to be tempered a little bit. 90% of Nebraska is in drought, 100% of Kansas is in drought, over 80% of Texas is in drought, with a lot of it in the Panhandle. If that's a realistic possibility that herd expansion isn't going to be what we thought it was, what does that mean for sustained profits in this industry?
Great question. I think once again that ratchets feeder cattle price up again because you're still going to have demand there. The demand is going to be strong, unlike the last 2 years where you weren't making any money, so you weren't really chasing those things. Guys are making good money, they're going to keep chasing those cattle. And that's going to be really detrimental in a lot of ways. That keeps beef too high for the customers or keeps it at a very high price, which concerns me. I want to see herd expansion because I don't want to see that happen to the ranchers. The climate has got to change. We've got to have a change in this drought thing, but until you do, you can't have herd expansion in any shape or form because it especially needs to happen in Texas.
Next week, our market analyst will be North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson. The porcine epidemic diarrhea virus continues to spread across the United States with appearances in about 60% of U.S. states. Now, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack has announced the USDA will require the swine industry to report the incidences of PEDv and swine delta coronavirus. The agency also wants to track the movement of pigs in vehicles from affected locations. The USDA says it's working with farm loan programs to provide producers with credit options and provide assistance to researchers regarding PEDv. 6 U.S. senators have sent a letter to members of the Senate Subcommittee on Agriculture asking for fiscal year 2015 funding for research, including development of a vaccine. The senators tally the death loss from PEDv at more than 6 million pigs across the country. The virus has no impact on pork meat and doesn't affect humans. Ron Brodersen is a veterinarian in Cedar County, located in northeast Nebraska and one of the top 10 pork producers in the state. Ron is also president-elect of the American Association of Swine Veterinarians. He joined us earlier this week to discuss the spread and severity of PEDv across Nebraska.
Well, it first arrived in Nebraska in December, and it had been causing a lot of problems in some of the more pig-dense states in Iowa and Minnesota and some other states as well. But and so in October, November, it really started moving around and finally reached Nebraska in December. Since December, then it has moved in January and February. It's moved throughout eastern Nebraska where most of the pigs are, and has I think I could say it's infected over half of the herds in eastern Nebraska.
So we're seeing that it's very prevalent in those herds. What are we experiencing in terms of mortality to the young pigs?
Well, on farms that farrow or birth newborn pigs, the pigs that are born that are 1 week of age or less, it's 100% death loss, and so that persists for about 3 weeks until the sow herd begins to develop immunity.
So there's really nothing that's working in those herds to save those piglets.
Well, there's a few management tools that are being used, and the producers and veterinarians have learned that if you can wean a pig that's 1 week old or more, they can save them, because what happens is the sows become sick, so they don't eat, and so they quit milking, and the pigs starve as well as die from dehydration from the diarrhea. So if they can get the pigs weaned, and if they are old enough to begin to eat and drink water with electrolytes, they can save more of those 7 to 10 day old pigs than if they remained on their sow.
Is controlled exposure a method that producers are using to spread the virus throughout their hog herd at one time?
Yes, that is a tool that's used to spread the virus through the sow herd so that the sow herd can more quickly become immune to it. The sows do get sick, but it's just a 3 or 4 day event, and the sows recover spontaneously and then develop an immunity that they can pass on to their piglets, the next group of piglets that are born.
Are you seeing that once the hogs are exposed to it the first time around, they're immune to it the second time around, or is it possible to catch it again, essentially?
Well, that's interesting that you asked, because the primary virus, when it goes through, generates an immune response that is permanent. However, there has been found some other viruses related to PED, and the new one is called a swine delta coronavirus, both of which cause similar symptoms, both of which appear to have originated in China. And the swine delta coronavirus can infect a herd that's already had PED, so there's not cross protection. The point in this, it appears that there's some pathway from China to the United States, and now more than one virus has entered the United States, and so we're concerned about other viruses now as well.
The American Association of Swine Veterinarians, the National Pork Board, and the National Pork Producers Council have sent a list of suggestions to the USDA that they feel might help the industry or might be something the agency could do. Can you expand on what those suggestions are?
Well, the AASV, along with the National Pork Board and the National Pork Producers Council, have made some suggestions as to what the USDA can do, and what they'd like to see is more emphasis placed at the borders or at ports of entry, so that we can stop any future viruses that might be coming from a foreign country. So that's what I think the veterinarians and the pork producers want to see. First is to do that, because I think the virus is so widespread here in the United States now that there's not a lot that can be done domestically at this point.
As of midweek, the USDA hadn't responded to the AASV suggestions. Our full interview with Ron is available online and includes steps you can take on your farm to increase biosecurity measures. Corn farmers in multiple states, including Iowa and Illinois, the country's top 2 producers, are battling rootworm resistance. Now, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln has documented a shift in susceptibility to rootworms that could cause problems for the state's growers. UNL Extension entomologist Bob Wright joined us Wednesday to explain why research has shown the need for crop rotation, different Bt varieties, and alternate control methods may be necessary to manage the western corn rootworm.
We've been doing research in Nebraska for the last couple of years, primarily led by Dr. Lance Mikey in our department, and we've been able to document similar results to what they've seen in Iowa and Illinois. There currently are 4 different Bt proteins that are incorporated into hybrids that are effective against rootworms, and we're seeing 2 of those, some evidence of resistance or reduced susceptibility in those other states as well as Nebraska now.
In Nebraska, where are the documented problems in the state, and under what conditions?
Okay, well, so far we've only done studies in northeast Nebraska and southwest Nebraska, but we're getting reports also in parts of central Nebraska. But typically in all the states in the Midwest where we're seeing this, it's where people have been growing the same type of Bt hybrid for 3 or more years in a row, corn after corn. That's sort of the minimum conditions where we start seeing resistance develop in some areas.
And what are you seeing in either those fields or in the trials you're doing?
Well, basically, we're seeing reduced susceptibility, so that means higher survival and more damage than we've seen in the past. on the traded rootworm hybrids. And so there's an interaction between the density of rootworms and the susceptibility. If you don't have too many rootworms, you may not notice a change, but we've had increasing numbers of rootworms in a lot of fields the last several years because we're growing more continuous corn. So a combination of high densities of rootworms and reduced susceptibility, you're probably going to see increased injury if you have a problem.
Specifically, what were the proteins that showed susceptibility in these traits?
Okay, it gets pretty complicated. There is a publication called the BT trait table that people can look up on the internet, but there's two proteins that have been a problem. The Cry3BB1 protein, which was originally marketed by Monsanto, and the Syngenta's Agrosure rootworm protein, which is called Cry3A. Those are the two that have been showing up having problems. There's other couple of proteins. The Herculex rootworm protein that Dow and Pioneer developed is working well across the Midwest. And then Syngenta just released a new type of hybrid this year called Duracade, which has a totally different type of protein. We don't have a lot of field experience with it yet, but there's no reports of that having problems.
You mentioned that this is usually seen in continuous corn situations where even 3 to 6, maybe even more years of continuous corn on corn. Short-term and long-term, what are not only the yield impacts, but the impacts to the field itself?
Well, again, if we're having less susceptibility to the BT proteins, the larvae will survive at higher levels and cause more damage, so you may see more lodging or yield loss from the rootworm feeding. The other issue is that people are seeing more beetles in fields, and some cases they may have to spray for silk clipping concerns. In terms of solutions, the number one recommendation is crop rotation. That works very well in Nebraska. Crop rotation with soybeans or other broadleaf plants which are not hosts for the rootworms. Some people are also going back to soil insecticides that can help, or planting time insecticides. But rotation is probably the best recommendation.
And switching from different BT varieties as well?
Right. Either go to a hybrid that has a different type of BT protein, or there are several options now with hybrids that have 2 different rootworm active proteins, and those are working well as well in our testing.
Bob mentioned a BT trait table during the interview. We'll link to that information on the Market Journal homepage. Applying nitrogen to soybeans may improve yields, but the jury is still out as to when those treatments are worthwhile. The April issue of Nebraska Farmer reviews University of Nebraska-Lincoln studies on the practice at 5 sites across the state in 2013. A yield response was reported only when high nitrogen rates were used, and UNL soil scientists claim those high rates aren't economical. You can read more about the findings in the April Nebraska Farmer. A few weeks ago, we talked with UNL Extension agronomist Roger Elmore to learn why early soybean planting can boost yield. This week, we talked with UNL Extension educator in climate variability Tapan Patek about why planting early might also provide climatological benefits. Tapan looked at historical precipitation data from 1981 to 2010 at York, Meade, and Clay Center and found in a given year, May provided the most rainfall, followed by June. By applying this information and evapotranspiration data, he tried to determine if farmers could gain an edge by putting soybeans in the ground sooner. He used a medium variety soybean and defined early planting as April 24th and late planting as May 27th. As you'll hear, by looking at numbers from 2008 to 2013, farmers who entered the field early could have had an advantage.
In general, for this medium variety for soybean, our total ET requirement for soybean, we kind of had it between 15 to 20 inches for across the whole growing season. So the way we determine the growing season is at the time it reaches certain GTDs, it'll consider from the planting till it reaches those values. And so that varies from 15 to 20 depending on the year. So some of the year, for example, 2012, where we had very little precipitation, but we also had higher radiation, higher temperatures during the growing season. And as you can see in the data, is that for 2012 we have a very high ET. because of that reason. So it kind of varies between year to year.
What would be the difference between early and late? If it's 15 to 20, right? So what would be the difference between planting early and late in terms of what the ET would differ?
Oh, so on an average, the ET difference from early versus late would be around 1 or 2 inches difference. And the other thing that might be of to notice is when you look at this, ET has 2 variables, evaporation and transpiration. So for example, when you're planting early, you're trying to minimize the evaporation part of the equation, and you're adding more in the transpiration. So even if you have that difference in ET, you're actually adding more of a transpiration part in the early planting dates, and that the results and data shows. And I was following with Jim Spatch, who is the soybean expert, and he mentioned that transpiration, if you're adding more that part, it directly relates to more yield, and so that's another aspect to take into consideration.
In precipitation, how much could it vary between early and late?
Yeah, and then when we compared those early versus late in terms of precipitation, total difference on an average was for 3 locations was between 2 inches to 3 inches, and some years, for example, 2012, if we had planted early, there was some moisture when we could have accumulated during the early part, which is late April, early May, and there was a difference of 3 to 4 inches on those years. So, but on an average, it was 2 to 3 inches more precipitation if we had planted early.
As you write, this obviously isn't necessarily a recommendation, but obviously just taken from the data of what could happen. And one of the considerations to note is that it would depend on what you had in your soil at the time of planting.
Okay.
Right.
In terms of, so in terms of when we started planting, if it is 100% recharge, if soil moisture is 100% recharge, maybe there might not be a difference when you have planted early versus late. But then again, as I mentioned, the difference might be in terms of adding the transpiration component. And even if you had early versus late, if there is no difference in moistures, but there will be difference in terms of total ET. So that's, and the other thing is when you had planted early, you have water use efficiency. You sort of have more water use efficiency if you had planted early, because of the early planted have less of a water deficit, vapor water deficit, and so you are kind of adding more less water efflux, so taking water out per unit of carbon dioxide influx. So that's another benefit of early planting.
Tapan says some of his other climatological work around soybeans includes studying how soil temperatures are warming up faster than in the past and looking at growing degree days of early planted versus late planted soybeans to determine if producers can use longer season varieties, which could result in higher yields. Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, of course, let's take a retrospective look over this last week. The first major storm system that was projected came in last week, and it turned out to be a bust in relation to what the models were putting out for moisture. We did see some scattered thunderstorm activity across portions of central and eastern Nebraska, but for the most part it was very isolated in nature, not widespread. And in most locations we didn't get very much in the way of significant moisture. There's a few little isolated pockets of a half-inch totals, but really most of it was between 1/10 and 1/4 of an inch. The more important system came out during the midweek period. We've seen some precipitation break out in eastern Nebraska during the morning hours. And then we've seen the thunderstorms develop along the cold front or just behind the cold front across portions of south central through central Nebraska, and then moving up into portions of northeast Nebraska. Essentially from that area, Hastings, all the way up into the Columbus region, we had numerous reports of anywhere from 1.5 inches to well over 3 inches of moisture. Now, as that system started to gain strength and move eastward, we started to see expansion of the thunderstorm activity, but a decrease in intensity. And so as we got into eastern Nebraska, very common totals were in the 1/2 inch to upwards of 1 inch range. So the models were projecting the heaviest moisture in eastern Nebraska. It actually fell in central Nebraska, so they were off basically about 90 miles westward is where the actual precip fell in relation to what the models were projecting. Now we have another system moving through this weekend, and depending on how it acts as it moves to the east of us, will go a long way to determine our weather for the remainder of this week. So let's take a look at this upper air models and see how the system will progress as we move through this next 7-day period. So for today, we have this upper air low to our southwest. It is going to really pump up some low-level moisture up into our region, so it's going to be a very windy day. And it's going to be a very humid day, particularly across eastern Nebraska in anticipation of the storm moving out. We may actually see a couple isolated thunderstorms develop across the western part of the state during the evening and overnight hours. But more importantly, as the system rapidly moves into the central plains, we should see severe weather breaking out across western Nebraska and some of that moving into eastern Nebraska, particularly during the afternoon and overnight hours. And then we'll start to see some cold air spilling in on the back side of it. So we do have a very good chance of moisture. Now this system will kind of open up and spin around, and so we'll get waves of energy moving around this low, giving us a chance of precipitation on an off and on basis throughout a good portion of the week. And as we get into Monday, you'll see the system slowly moves to our east, so we'll start to see more of the cooler air on the backside of it. But again, we'll be dealing with this off and on scattered shower activity. And then this system starts to make its way into the Ohio River Valley, and on the backside we'll see a much cooler fetch in at least Wednesday, and we'll start to see some warming conditions developing across western part of the state, and that will start to translate eastward as the main moisture band moves into the Ohio River Valley, and by Friday we'll see that all this will have cleared from our region. So if we look at the temperature forecast, very warm conditions today, and then we'll see a cool down through the early part of the week with those scattered thunderstorm and shower activity, and then a gradual warm up as we move to the week's end. In terms of the 8 to 14 day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, we see the cooler conditions remain in our region. In terms of precipitation, we do show this drier than normal conditions, but there are increasing signs that a very active pattern will continue, so this one may not verify.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews on cattle markets, the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, early planted soybeans, and rootworm resistance in corn can be found on the Market Journal website. They can also be found on the Market Journal mobile app for smartphones and tablets, available to download for free in the Google Play and iTunes stores. Next week, Frayne Olson will be our marketing analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.